Hi again, everyone. And I'm just here to welcome our guests for this conversation. Uh, and in particular, let me just introduce our moderator, Amy Brady, who is a writer as well as the deputy publisher of Guernica magazine and editor in chief of Chicago Review of Books, where she writes a monthly column called Burning Worlds, which explores how contemporary fiction addresses issues of climate change, which is very appropriate to our topic this week and certainly to this particular play. And I want to thank Rob and Charlie and Arpita for joining the conversation. And I will hand it over to Amy.
Great. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, everyone, for allowing me to join you tonight. What a fantastic performance. That was such a pleasure to sit and watch. Arpita and Charlie, you must be so proud of the work that you've done. Great, well, let's go ahead and have a conversation. And I believe, unless things have changed, that folks who are watching tonight can put their questions into the chat function of YouTube. And if we have some time at the end of the evening, we will get to as many of those questions as we can. But first, I get the great pleasure of talking with you all. So again, I had such a good time watching this performance. And my first question is to you, Charles, about the writing of this play. So many contemporary narrative entertainments that address the refugee crisis tend to focus on the moment of when refugees are in fact in crisis, when they're fleeing their home countries to a new land. And this play, very smartly, I thought, focuses on refugees who've already made a home in a new country, and in fact have already had the first generation of Americans as part of that family. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that choice, and if it was kind of influenced by your thinking about climate change as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think that as I think about that, for many refugees, for sort of quote unquote traditional refugees, maybe that's a terrible phrasing, there's a crisis, an event, sort of a bridging of worlds. People move from one place to another, and then they can sort of settle, perhaps. That's certainly what my ancestors did whenever they immigrated. But with the climate crisis, we don't see it. There's no end in sight. So I guess in terms of just the dramatic engine of the play, if you take these characters and put them in the future, post, following their immigration, but the crisis is still going on, then I don't know. I guess that's sort of like how I'm thinking about it right now. The crisis hasn't ended. So to my mind, it's okay to set them post immigration, but the crisis is this ongoing thing.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you. No, it's really fascinating. Arpita, my next question is for you, because I, as a huge theater goer and fan of the theater myself, I have such huge respect for directors of the theater, and especially those who are directing stories that attempt to balance the planetary scale of climate change, which was kind of always in the background of this story, with the smaller, more individual narrative arcs of the characters. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you balance those two scales, and if the fact that this is a very personal story set against a backdrop of climate change influenced any of your artistic choices.
Yeah, I think when Charlie and I first started talking about the play, I asked a lot of questions to Charlie about the world and where he kind of saw the stakes here of what were people experiencing, how did they come, what's Manhattan now versus Vermont, so there was a lot of questions I was asking to kind of understand where the characters were coming from and what they were really feeling. And I think what's interesting is in the work and in the time we've spent, we feel that, I think, now in the journey of the play or working on the play, most in the young people. We feel that weight of the decisions that have been made before in sort of their mini drama that plays out of just two young people trying to figure out how to survive, just be teenagers, and are then sort of faced with this, looking at these two adults and seeing how they have failed them. And I was interested in like climate as a backdrop, also in terms of intergenerational, how this kind of trauma, like any kind of trauma, reverberates through generations and how it's sort of passed on. And so we looked a lot at, or talked a lot about Saj's relationship to Abdullah, to his father, and his own relationship to, Abdullah to his own father, and same way with Manu and Pania. It sort of informed really sort of how these characters were tied to each other, or were trying to untie themselves, untangle themselves. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much for that. And so many stories about climate change. I've seen so many, writers and artists can tend to isolate stories, and here to see how two families are colliding and indeed are very deeply entwined with each other was really fascinating. That's great, thanks. Rob, I have a question for you. I know that with your policy work at the NRDC, storytelling is integral to the work that you do. And here is a play that is about refugees, it's about climate change, it's about generations, but at base it is a story. And I was wondering if you, as a policy expert, could talk a little bit about why storytelling is so important, not just in the arts, but also in the kind of public conversations at large about these larger issues.
Yeah, that's, I just have to say, Charlie and Arpita, this is really a remarkable play. I was really, I just enjoyed it from beginning to end, and it's so chillingly prescient of situations that people are already finding themselves in, and that so many more people in the future are going to be encountering. So I was just really impressed with how the story came together, and the complexity of it, and how it played out on so many levels. And it's, storytelling is so powerful for getting people to understand the gravity of any situation that they're in, I think. And I think the climate crisis has suffered for a long time because we've attempted to address it in the advocacy world the way we've addressed other issues to some degree, like fighting it out with facts and figures and charts and graphs and all this scientific information that often doesn't move people to action in a climate context. If you're talking about health impacts of air pollution or toxic chemicals, it's a little easier to grasp the immediacy of the problem. And with climate, I think we've, for a long time, battled against the fact that this has always been perceived as it's a problem for a future generation. It's not a here and now problem. And what this type of storytelling does is it really grounds it not only in the today, but it really shows you through the power of narrative, like what a plausible future, an all too plausible future, really looks like, and how it's going to affect real people. That this isn't just going to be the days getting warmer or more uncomfortable or storms coming, but this is how it has real implications beyond just the environment. I mean, it threatens people's livelihoods. It threatens where people live, and not in the ways that you would necessarily expect. So I really love seeing these types of stories. And when you can bring personal stories into the policy context for people that do the type of work I do, it can have a real power.
Great, thanks, Rob. Well, speaking of how the climate crisis affects people in real life, Charles, your refugees came from the Maldives and Samoa, and unfortunately, the climate crisis is going to be affecting folks all over the globe, and have indeed already started to affect folks from all over the globe. But could you speak a little bit about why you chose to focus on those two places?
Sure. Well, the Maldives is a very threatened country. It lies very low, and so it was just the place that I sort of locked in on. Realized how threatened it is. I don't know what people predict in terms of how long it's going to be around. I guess that depends on sea level rise. But it's also, I was interested in looking at countries that are not global powers, countries where people, refugees from these places will really be vulnerable. They're not Americans. They're not from Western Europe. They're not, so I guess that's one aspect of the crisis and possible impending events that we can. It's hard to just even wrap your mind around all the implications. Anyway, so I mean, there's some degree of randomness in choosing locations, but I wanted to choose island nations that felt far away from American life, and that were threatened, and where there was a good degree of vulnerability, because I think that's unfortunately going to be the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Arpita, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but Rob, I want to come back to you again just a second, because I also know that in your work at the NRDC, you focus a lot, or perhaps primarily, on sea level rise and flooding issues and what have you. And I was wondering if you could add a little bit of real world context, or an additional real world context to what Charlie is saying. Where are we seeing sea level rise as a threat already? And are there any places that might surprise some of the folks who are tuning in tonight?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there are several areas around the world that are already dealing with the chronic and acute impacts of sea level rise. Bangladesh comes immediately to mind, where you have the tides are slowly rising, and saltwater intrusion has already rendered large parts of agricultural lands non-productive. So you have people on the move, in addition to being affected by monsoons and storms that come in off the Indian Ocean. Here in the United States, some of the areas that are most at peril are those that we see on the news when there's a major hurricane, for instance. So we think of the area around Houston, Texas, and Hurricane Harvey. The Carolinas have been having a streak of bad luck and bad weather the last few years, and Puerto Rico, of course, because of Hurricane Maria. And we often think, here in the United States, we often think of refugees are something that's not in this country. Those are people in other countries who are displaced and become refugees. But by some measures, we already have the beginnings of a internal refugee problem here in the United States. I mean, after Hurricane Katrina, tens of thousands of people permanently left New Orleans, many of whom went to Houston and then were subsequently displaced by Hurricane Harvey. In Puerto Rico, you have about 130,000 people that permanently left the island, most of whom came to the mainland United States. And then at even smaller scales, there are people that we're probably not even capturing that, like in the Carolinas, people have lived now through Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Florence in 2018, and Hurricane Dorian in 2019. They're already making the choice, and in many cases, leaving their home and places of work behind and trying to find a safer place to live. And in many instances, doing that completely without any assistance from the government. So, these are things that are already happening on large scales and small, throughout the world, and even here within the United States. And that's a problem that my team in NRDC is really trying to focus on. Like, it's hard to admit, or I guess recognize, that there are millions of people even in this country that are not going to be able to continue living where they presently live. How we come to grips with that reality and cope with it is going to define in many ways what our nation looks like in 30, 40, or 50 years.
Great, thank you for that, Rob. I always think it's just so important and so wonderfully put, as you did just now, to kind of couch these types of stories in reality, because I guess you said we are in fact seeing climate change affect so many communities, and yeah, we're going to see a lot more of it in our lifetimes.
Well, there are stories like this, like Charlie's and Arpita's, in many ways playing out in real time right now. I mean, in Miami, Florida, there are the more affluent areas of Miami Beach, of course, are on the beach. But there's a part of Miami where it's about 11 feet higher than the rest of the city and county. It's the highest point in Miami-Dade County. And it's where a lot of Cuban Americans, a lot of Haitian refugees have settled over the years. And now suddenly they are finding that they live on increasingly, or real estate that's increasingly of interest to developers, because people are seeing that, hey, the high ground is where people may be more interested in living. So you're already seeing stories like we just saw in Quik-Mart playing out in real life in various parts of the country.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Arpita, I want to return a moment to what you said earlier about generations, and ask a question. I'd like to ask the question to all three of you, though. Arpita, you said earlier that you and Charlie thought a lot through about kind of the intergenerational dynamic of these characters. And as I was watching this, I couldn't help but think of the generational, dare I say, divide that is kind of happening, in the United States and indeed all around the world. Certainly that we've seen with the Black Lives Matter protests, but also in the context of the climate crisis. So many of the most vocal activists right now are young people. So my question is, did you guys have in mind these real life young activists, as you were either, writing this play or directing it or watching it? I guess I'm just wondering if that was as kind of omniscient over the play as it was for me as I was watching it.
That's really great to hear, Amy, because it was definitely omniscient for me. Actually, Charlie and I met because I worked on a show with UNICEF that we did about climate that featured specifically young activists, and it was set in India, where the climate crisis is also pretty profound and really affects sort of poor people there. So, and we did it in schools around the city, around New York, for students, and featured a lot of young activists and the work they were doing. And for me, in a way, what I love about this play is that even though Saj and Penny are sort of like, they're not wearing their politics, it's sort of very apparent to me. I was telling Charlie this, that when I was graduating from high school, I had no concerns about the planet. I mean, I was just not motivated politically even, really. And it's so remarkable to me to see young people now and really what they feel, and there's this kind of defiance in the face of a kind of hopelessness too, of a real sense that the generation before has failed them, and they must stand up and do the work, and a real mistrust of sort of the generation that has come before. And that becomes really apparent in the play in a different way, where sort of neither Manu nor Abdullah can be trusted to make decisions that are going to actually impact these young people's future. So that was very much playing in my mind about defiance in the face of not being able to trust the adults you're supposed to trust. I guess I didn't grow up with that kind of crisis, and that feels very profound to me, and something I think we have to kind of honor in our stories that tend to focus actually on our generations or beyond, because we're the one usually telling the stories. So yeah, that was definitely something on my mind.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that, it's such a distressing issue. And like Arpita, I certainly wasn't thinking about this when I was a teenager, or even older than a teenager. And once I became aware of it, it was really, it's a really depressing notion, how badly we've screwed up the planet and continue to do so. And really the thing that gives me hope about it is the young generation and the way young people get it. It's almost like this sort of more innocent, pure energy somehow. Anyway, and so I was really interested in like finding the hopeful part of the story, and having that be represented by Saj and his generation, I guess. But he's really the character who embodies that in this play. Yeah, it's such an interesting phenomenon, and in real life, I'm super inspired by young people like Greta, and anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think on climate change, I think the leadership role that the youth in this country and abroad have stepped into, and the energy that they have breathed back into the climate debate has been really inspiring. And you see that in Black Lives Matter and a lot of the social issues that are challenging the nation right now too. This is not the old guard of 40 and 50 somethings that are organizing this and leading this effort. These are largely young people working together, and in kind of a decentralized way. They're doing advocacy in a much more socially conscious and I think forward-thinking way than the old models, I guess, that we've often deployed in these issues. And it's really terrific to see. And it's challenging people at a lot of different levels now to think about these issues in different ways too. When younger people start getting so engaged, it is far more likely that these issues are going to end up at the dining room table than if it's just the older adults talking about it. So it injects the debate. I think it takes it out of the hallways where decision makers are. It takes it out of the adults only conversations, and it brings it to a much larger number of people, whether it's in your living room or whether it's on the street. And it's an energy we desperately need, and I'm so glad, as an environmental advocate, I'm so glad it's there.
Great, thank you guys. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to address questions that are coming in from our YouTube folks. So I'll just ask one more question. It's actually to you, Arpita, and I admit it doesn't really have, I don't think it has anything to do with climate change, so maybe you could find a way to tie it in. I want to address the fact that we are all doing this virtually. I have seen a lot of theater in my day, and the last few months I've also have seen a lot online. What was it like to direct a play virtually?
Oh, I think I lamented about this a lot with Charlie, and yeah, I think it's really hard. I want to say, because I think, and I just can't appreciate our actors enough. I mean, I don't think I have enough words of appreciation for actors who not only completely dive into the play and build a performance over 6 hours, which is like totally insane, but now we're asking them for all these sort of like additional things of like technology, which is their mic and their internet, and there are just so many things that are have to be on their mind to kind of tell the story clearly. And so I think that I just want to really appreciate actors and their kind of artistic integrity in amidst a lot of pressures. I mean, I think like a little bit of our time, probably not half, but a little bit of our time definitely went with like entrances, exits, which are they're just not the same on Zoom, in the way that they would be. I think what's great is that we're doing this, and so we're still able to work and collaborate with each other, but it really makes you miss the real thing. Like, at least for me, it really, like, I'm fine with the windowless studio now. I'm going to go back to it, the windowless studio, with a whole lot more joy than I would have before, just to be in the room and feel that energy, and do this work live and in the moment, I think is something that I really feel I miss. But it's lovely to be able to collaborate and do the work, and it's really lovely for me to see some of the actors I didn't know and then I did know just do such beautiful work. It's really all credit to them. It's heroic work. Yeah.
Well, you did a beautiful job, and I'm sure everyone will agree that the acting was also incredible and the writing was amazing. So thank you guys for giving us such an amazing play to watch and listen to this evening. So I want to turn now to some of the questions that are coming in from YouTube, and to just encourage the folks that are watching to please keep giving us your questions. We will get to as many as we can. The first question for us tonight, I think thematically links to the title of the evening. The question is, how does race intersect with the issue of climate crisis refugees? Because a lot of these refugees are people of color. I think that question is for all three of you, so whoever wants to take it first can.
Well, it definitely factors in. Again, looking just, most of my work focuses domestically, so I'll answer this from the perspective of kind of domestic of the United States. But lower income Americans and people of color are far more likely to be at risk or to have suffered some harm due to a climate related incident, whether that's one of the many hurricanes that's happened in recent years, or the flooding that occurred throughout the Midwest in 2019, or if you're talking about wildfires in California, or even the effects of drought, which the last few years we've been fairly lucky on that regard, but those events are coming in the future as well. There's an increasing amount of research out there showing, documenting this, that climate-driven disasters actually widen the equity gap and in a community. So you actually have these situations where more affluent people can strangely become more affluent because of a disaster, whereas poor people become poorer. So a lot of that traces back to just the how people have to cope with the circumstances of a post-disaster recovery. So, if you're wealthier and you've got a nice house, in a strange way, a disaster, you can turn it around into an opportunity. Like, oh, honey, we always wanted to put that new kitchen and an extension on the bedroom in, and now this hurricane's taking the back wall off, and we're going to get this insurance check. Let's just go ahead and, instead of just rebuild, let's go ahead and expand the house. And suddenly you end up with you go from a house that was worth X amount before the storm, and then after you've done these repairs and expansion, you've got a house that's actually worth more than the house you had before the storm. Whereas, if you don't have that economic advantage, if you're living day to day, as many Americans do, you're scrambling to find a place for your family to live. You're figuring out, how am I going to go back to work while I'm also putting my life back together? You're hoping that your place where you work is even going to be reopening, and that you're going to have a paycheck to make ends meet. And you in many ways become very reliant on federal disaster aid to kind of get you through that time. And federal disaster aid is not something that you want to have to rely upon. And there are issues with federal disaster aid that can also contribute to the challenges that less affluent Americans face, and are increasingly facing. So, yeah, it's a huge component of what's happening as a result of climate change already.
Great, thank you for that, Rob. When compared to the rest of the world, I think it's fair to say that the United States is a fairly climate stable place, though of course we're already experiencing, many catastrophes as a result of climate change. But I think that for some people, it might be a surprise to hear that this kind of inequitable distribution of climate catastrophe is happening here in the United States. It's certainly happening in places around the world, and particularly in the global South as well. Great. Charlie, please.
Oh, I just that question actually makes me. I know a couple of the other plays in this series later this week, and the ones that I know are wonderful. One of them in particular, by Erica Dickerson Spenza, which I don't remember what day it is, but it's called Colored Water, and it's about a Katrina family, I think, if I'm remembering right. And it's a beautiful play, and I just would encourage people to tune in. It really gets into environmental racism in the United States. So yeah, it's certainly a very fraught topic, and we're not immune to that here in this country. So.
Right, I think that particular play might be tomorrow night, if I remember correctly.
Okay, probably. Yeah, I'm sure you're right.
Yeah. Great, fantastic. We have another question coming in from YouTube. I'm curious to know if what happened in this play is happening now in Washington Heights, this pushing out of small business owners for immigrant housing. Does anybody would like to speak to that question?
I can say that I have no knowledge of that, at least not like this. If it's happening, it might be happening for other reasons. I imagine it's not due to climate, refugee housing, but I don't really. That didn't feed into this play. So anyway, but if it's happening, then I'd love to know about it.
Hey, Charlie, I apologize if I somehow missed this at the beginning of the play, but do you ever actually pin this to a specific time in the future?
That's a good question.
It's left pretty open, right? It's clearly
we don't make it very obvious. But I think if you comb the script for clues, it has to be something like 40 or 50 years in the future. It could maybe be a little bit later. And I hate to actually, like, I wouldn't want to hit anyone over the head with it. But anyway, I think that might be the ballpark.
Well, I think it's totally right in the ballpark. I think you chose a good location and a good setting. So, like, after the play started, I actually jumped on a website to check. Like, I wonder what are the sea level? How high is Washington Heights? I did have to go. I'm like, oh yeah, Charlie was on it. He had that. He nailed it.
It is the highest point of Manhattan.
Charlie, that question does make me think about something, though. So I am joining you all tonight from New York City, and can say absolutely that gentrification, at least, is something that is absolutely happening, all around the city in all 5 boroughs. And but what is so interesting about your play is that it's a gentrification story, but it's kind of set in a different context. It focuses on refugees. Would you mind speaking a little bit to how you came to that specific context?
Sure. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time living in New York as well, and I'm just, all too familiar with the gentrification that's happened to the city from the time that I first got there for college to the present. It's drastically changed. I'm dating myself now, but I agree with you. It's a problem, and it makes the city feel more sterile. Pushes out. I mean, as a theater artist, we can, my friends and I can barely survive on what we earn from art gigs and other things. So it's a big problem. It worries me. It's a reality, and to explore climate change. The climate change refugee crisis in the context of that, I guess that was interesting to me because it felt like this is just another dose of like what we're dealing with, could be dealing with for time to come.
Great, thank you. So we have another question. It's a question about perhaps some of your influences, or just perhaps of kind of what other types of stories you guys are familiar with. This question is, are you aware of the Waterkeeper Alliance or a recent collaboration film with Extinction Rebellion, which is called The Condor and the Eagle? This person calls it an excellent telling of truth tale.
I am not either, but I'm very intrigued.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll have to go look that up. I'm very familiar with the Waterkeeper Alliance. I actually, in a previous job, I was the Lake Champlain Lake Keeper and was part of the Waterkeeper Alliance. So I was happy to be part of that little group. But yeah, I'm gonna have to go check the film out. Thanks for the recommendation.
It's definitely on my to watch or to seek out list as well. Well, good folks. Well, you know what? I think we are kind of at the end of questions from YouTube. So how about I have one more question that's been rattling in the back of my brain as I've been watching this. As I'm sure like all 3 of you, I spend a lot of time seeking out media stories about the climate crisis, about the refugee crisis, trying to find out as much as I can. But I also read a lot of novels about climate change and how authors are addressing climate change in a fictional context. I was wondering if the 3 of you might speak to how theater is addressing climate change, or maybe perhaps put another way, what do you guys think that theater can tell us about the climate crisis that perhaps some other means of storytelling can't?
Yeah. Arpita, did you?
Go ahead, Charlie. You want to go first?
Why don't you go first?
Okay. So, I mean, when we can gather again together, hopefully, inshallah, it will be, I think, the live form, and you are literally like in a space breathing the same air as the person next to you is quite democratizing if we decide, who these stories are for, which I think is an important question who we want to reach. That can be, it's very powerful to sort of like experience a story live as something happening live, the exchange between the actor and you. That is something different and not like watching actually film or television, which is something you can keep at a distance. And so theater has the ability to, I think, confront as much. And I think that's why particularly I'm so moved by the end of this play when Abdullah and Saj talk to us. And we have, Charlie and I have talked a lot about where is Saj talking to us from? you know, and how are we cast as an audience? So I think that's a really wonderful opportunity in theater where you can really sort of like confront and speak directly, which is a lot of the work that many of the playwrights have been doing, this breaking the fourth wall, and actually embracing and making the audience an active participant and actually casting the audience in some way. So I think when plays do that, they are fully using the live theatrical event. And I think that's really exciting for inciting change and inciting a change in thinking. That is, I think, very unique to the theater medium.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and particularly the idea that theater can be very confrontational. But I also question, I think, you know, it's the question of how influential can the theater be? There's a high barrier of entry to the theater in America, to attending theater. You have to be able to get to a theater. You have to be able to buy tickets. You know, theaters, it's not, everyone doesn't go to the theater because it's hard for a lot of people. And so I do remember a professor of mine, Daniel Goldfarb, in grad school, he's a playwright and also writes for television, talking about how, in his opinion, theater is sort of where social change happens first, and then it radiates out to this sort of more cinematic media, which are also more accessible to sort of the larger population. So that's interesting to me. You know, if you're trying to make a piece of writing, you know, some sort of dramatic material that is going to have an impact, where is the place to, how do you get it seen? And I think, you know, as theater artists, that's something we think about, or should think about.
It seems like, you know, theater is a place where there's a lot more experimentation than you get in movies, which have such a high, you know, production cost and access to screens, et cetera, or even television in this day and age. You know, a lot of the, you know, theater lends itself more to telling, experimenting with different ways of telling stories, with the stories themselves, and finding the things that really resonate with the broader society. So this is my first experience, though, with climate fiction theater. So I'm not a big theater goer, but really was so excited to find out about this project that NRDC was partnering with the new group to do this, and I'm going to pay a lot more attention. I know that.
Great. Well, thank you, all three of you, for this wonderful discussion. I could talk to you all night, but I'm sure some folks need to have their dinner and attend to other things, so we can call it there. But thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Amy,
thank you,
so
Amy.
much. Yes, and yes, thank you, Rob, Charlie, Arpita, for having this discussion and sharing it with all of us. I want to just remember to mention here the aspect of the, sort of comes right out of the question that you guys were all just addressing. The aspect of NRDC's work, which this is part of, which is an initiative called Rewrite the Future, which is, as described, it encourages more varied and compelling climate stories in entertainment. And it's, you know, it's kind of looking at the role of the creative artists in you know, making us see this problem in new ways, see it differently. And that, I'll say that this play, I think, does that beautifully. And at least from my perspective, working at a theater company, you know, we need more plays like this. As you know, Rob was saying, it's his first exposure of a play that addresses this, and there are plays for sure. There aren't that many compared to some on other topics, and there also aren't that many produced. So we need more. And, may this be the beginning of that, or not the beginning, but a step in that. And for folks listening, a reminder that if you enjoyed the reading tonight, this stream, the availability of this particular reading will be for 3 more days. So please encourage folks to watch it. It will be on the New Group's YouTube channel, and as will this discussion. And as mentioned, there are readings every night this week, including Erica Dickerson Dispenza's reading tomorrow night, which is Shadowland, and it's in the same series as Colored Water. And at 7 o'clock, with a discussion following that as well. And then on Thursday, the Climate Arts Activision panel, which is part of this festival, but also part of Rewrite the Future's work, at 6 o'clock before the reading on Thursday. So thank you guys again for this terrific reflection on the play. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow or later this week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank
Bye.
you. Goodbye.